Close your eyes and imagine. You are quietly walking through a small village nestled against the slopes of a remote mountain in medieval Europe. Pale moonlight spills over thatched rooftops and muddy paths. A dog barks in the distance from a manor house far away, blending with the faint chime of a church bell echoing through the early mist. Everything is still, and yet it's as if the world is whispering to you. This is not just a long-lost world. It is a part of you, a fragment of your soul, where ancient fears, fragile hopes, and quiet dreams were born and still linger within us today. In those rotting wooden houses, where flickering firelight dances across the wrinkled faces of weary peasants, stories were passed down from one generation to the next. There were no phones, no dazzling lights, only the howl of the wind through wooden cracks and the murmuring voices telling tales by the hearth. They spoke of kings seated on cold thrones, of brave knights who never returned, of silent monks copying manuscripts by candlelight, and of children born into the heavy wheels of destiny. You will hear all these stories, not as an outsider, but as if you were living among them, breathing the air of that time, feeling the sweat of the blacksmith on your hands, hearing the sigh of a mother sending her son off to war, and gazing up at towering castles, where power and loneliness always walked hand in hand. The Middle Ages were not merely a dark time, they were an age where people yearned for the light more than ever. Amidst the fog of plague, war, and hunger, they still prayed. They still loved. They still dreamed. And they still believed. Tonight's story is not just history. It is a lullaby to carry you away from the hurried pace of modern life and into a slower, quieter rhythm. Together, we will cross deserted fields, sit beside a monk transcribing scripture, witness a noble wedding, and wander through the bustling market beneath the old stone walls. And within each story, you may find a piece of yourself, quiet, humble, yet deeply connected to something ancient. If you're hearing this at the end of a long day, let history be a soft blanket that wraps around your soul. Not to study, not to memorize, but simply to feel, to understand, and to drift into a deep sleep, where you won't just dream of castles, but might also find yourself within the dream. The story begins now. Let the Middle Ages whisper to you, through every breath, every image, every memory we still carry in our hearts, even if we don't always realize it. When night falls and the wind whispers through the old wooden doors, the whole world seems to pause for a brief, quiet moment. In the dim glow of an oil lamp, where time seems to slow down, a doorway opens, leading us into an age long gone, a time when people lived between faith and darkness, between hope and fear. This is the world of the Middle Ages. There is no blazing fortress to open this story, nor the sound of galloping hooves across a battlefield. Only the soft footsteps of an ordinary man returning from the wheat fields after a long, weary day. His sleeves are damp with sweat, his back soaked by the evening mist. In the distant village, smoke rises gently from thatched rooftops, and the lowing of cattle echoes like a chorus from a simple, enduring world. Inside a small, slanted cottage, a family gathers around a pot of thick porridge. No one says much, only the clinking of wooden spoons against wooden bowls, and eyes filled with unspoken thoughts, gratitude for surviving one more day, and the quiet worry for tomorrow. Words are few, but love and kinship are enough to keep them warm through the brutal winter, enough to help them find some peace amid the uncertainty of the times. Not far away, in a stone monastery tucked deep in the woods, candlelight dances across the yellowing pages of old parchment. An aging monk sits silently, copying the Bible, each stroke steady, like the rhythm of his breath. No one but him knows that these letters will one day survive centuries, carrying the light of knowledge into Europe's darkest days. He leaves behind no name, no statue, only fragile ink on aged pages, like the whispering voice of the past. That world moved by strict rules. Kings ruled from their castles. Nobles lived in luxury. Farmers toiled beneath the sun and rain. Each person had their place on the great wheel of history. Yet behind every role were countless untold stories. Stories of a mother who lost her child to the plague, of an orphan boy who found shelter in the village chapel, of a knight who gave up glory to defend his people from bandits. These were not stories found in textbooks, but they quietly wove the fabric of an entire age. And so, in the sacred silence of the night, sleep came as a final gift. The farmer curled up beneath a coarse wool blanket. The monk dozed over his half-finished manuscript. The children breathed softly, dreaming of a day without hunger or cold. All of them, whether rich or poor, powerful or humble, lived with the same fragile wish, to make it through another day and to be remembered by someone, even if only in a story whispered years later. In the misty darkness, the Middle Ages do not appear as clashing swords or dazzling crowns. They come instead as humanity's gentle sigh, quiet, profound, but persistent. And when the door of time creaks open, those fragments of memory drift back, like a distant dream, softly speaking to the one who listens. When night falls over the silent fields, and only the soft wind brushes across the thatched rooftops, the medieval world awakens again in memory, like an ancient tale whispered beside a late-night lamp. A world where moonlight slides gently across cold stone walls, and life turns endlessly, like a great wheel that never stops spinning. There, amidst the quiet countryside, humble farmers lived lives of quiet perseverance. From dawn's red light flooding the fields to the ashen hues of dusk settling over the straw roofs, they worked without pause. Their calloused hands clung to the earth and to life, sowing seeds deep into the soil of their homeland. They didn't dream of much, only enough food, enough warmth, enough peace to survive the next winter. Inside the small, low cottage, the family gathered by the fire. The meal was nothing more than stale bread and a bland bowl of soup. Yet the children's laughter, the peaceful silence of the aging wife, and the tired but warm gaze of the father nourished the soul more deeply than any wealth could. Outside, the Lord's castle stood still, a looming shadow cast across the village. Each villager belonged to an order already set, born a peasant and dying one, and none dared to imagine a different fate. Yet beneath the brown soil, quiet shifts had begun. In distant towns where footpaths turned into marketplaces, a new class emerged. Merchants, scribes, traders, hagglers. They needed no noble blood, only the wit to count and bargain. And from their quiet footsteps, a new world was taking shape, where coin replaced sword, and the written word began to challenge ancient legends. The church, once the spiritual refuge of generations, was now being questioned. Some priests had forgotten humility. Some sermons no longer led toward the light. And in distant monasteries, scholars stayed up through the night, poring over old manuscripts, reading Plato, reading Cicero, asking questions that had never been voiced before. Everything remained quiet, but no longer unchanging, like water seeping beneath the old earth. The ancient world began to tremble, not with cries of revolution, but with the breath of dreamers, readers, merchants, and kings who now longed for more than just a throne. And yet, when night fell again, all returned to silence. The villagers still slept beneath thatched roofs. They still believed in God, in the harvest, in the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. They did not know it yet, but they themselves, in all their simplicity, were the roots that held the soul of the age in place. And perhaps, for those listening tonight, sleep will come like a gentle stream, flowing through the ancient fields, past the valley where bells echo at dusk, and into a faraway place where humanity still lives between darkness and light, between fear and hope, between death and all that begins anew. So sleep well, because the story isn't over yet, and tomorrow the sun will rise again over that little village, as it always has and always will. And as night spreads its quiet black cloak over the fields, beneath a humble thatched roof, a mother holds her child in her arms and whispers a story about a time when children like you, like her, were born into the chill of mist and the distant chime of church bells. About children who had no dolls, no school books, only mud, calloused hands, and eyes that had learned to endure before they could even understand the world. They grew up with the seasons, familiar with the scent of dry straw and smoke from the hearth. Some lost their mothers to the biting cold of winter. Others strapped hunger to their waists and went out to work before the sun had even risen. Yet still, they lived. They found small joys in the bubbling of streams, in games played with stones and dry leaves. Even in poverty, there was still room for laughter. There were still handholds in the dark to remind each other they were not alone in this world. Far away, in towns slowly growing crowded, a new class was taking shape. They had no noble blood, no crests hanging on walls, but they possessed knowledge and resourcefulness. Merchants, artisans, scribes working in dim ends, they quietly reshaped the social order with things as simple as a spool of yarn, a brown ink contract, or a wax seal pressed by hand. Meanwhile, atop the high hill where the stone castle stood like the soul of an age, knights still sharpened their swords, still believed that honor could save a man's soul. But the times were shifting. Loyalty was no longer bound solely to sword and spear. It lived in words, in laws, and in dreams of sailing beyond the horizon to find a new world. And in the monasteries, candlelight slowly dripped onto parchment, where monks copied each line of scripture, each ancient poem. Some spent their entire youth bent over a cold stone desk, their hands trembling as they preserved the faith of a fading century. They did not know that the world outside was changing by the hour, but it was through their quiet belief and patience that humanity's memory did not wash away in the floods of time. Dear listener, you are walking now through invisible walls of time, stepping into a world where every life was a story worthy of being told. Whether a poor village child, a merchant counting silver, or a silent scribe, each added a fragment of soul to the tapestry of the medieval world. Raw, bitter, and beautiful. And now, as your eyes begin to grow heavy, let these whispers lead you into sleep. Imagine yourself beside a small fire, listening to an old man tell the story of his life. A life without stage lights, yet full of moments more real than any legend. Because in the end, history is not only made of kings and crowns. It is the sigh of a mother who lost her child. It is the song of the blacksmith hammering in the rain. It is the dream left unfinished by a child who fell asleep beside a loom. And as you sleep, these lives will come to you, not to frighten, but to embrace you like a gentle reminder that You are never alone in the great river of humanity. Sleep well, and I'll meet you again in the next chapter of the dream. And as the morning mist lingers over the soaked fields, the church bells once again echo through the peaceful countryside. Barefoot steps of the peasants leave imprints on the soft earth, and the hands long accustomed to tools, backs bent from wind and toil, never seem to rest. A new day begins, repeating itself through the centuries, and yet still stirs our hearts every time we imagine it. They, the ones who lived under thatched roofs, where hearth smoke blended with the scent of hay and the sweat of laborious days. Though poor, they had evenings gathered by the flickering firelight, sharing small tales of crops, the weather, and sometimes of war. A war they did not fully understand, only that it took fathers, sons, husbands, and left behind a mother's eyes clouded with sorrow, gazing silently toward the horizon. Far from the villages, in the mist-covered hills, knights rode beneath fluttering banners. Their armor gleamed in the sun, but behind the metal was a heart capable of feeling, of loving, of aching. They carried noble ideals to defend the land, uphold honor, and remain true to God. But in the cold solitude of their tents, they were just lonely men, yearning for a glance from a woman they had never dared to touch. In silent monasteries, candlelight flickered over the pages of worn leather-bound books. Monks devoted their lives to copying sacred scriptures and ancient poems, safeguarding the light of civilization through turbulent times. They did not seek fame. They only hoped the words they transcribed would live on in the hearts of those yet to come. And indeed, it was they, in quiet perseverance, who preserved the flame through the darkest centuries. In the cities, the clanging of hammers echoed down cobbled streets where blacksmiths sweated over horseshoes, weapons, or simply a tiny iron lock. At vibrant markets, women selling cloth, spices, and pottery laughed and bartered with joy, as if they themselves were breathing life into an age thought to be grim. Though forgotten in the chronicles, it was they who kept the pulse of the medieval world beating. Can you hear it? In the gentle night breeze and the creaking wood of an old home, the whispered stories drift across centuries. Every soul, peasant, monk, merchant, or warrior, left behind a drop of spirit in the great vessel we call history. We need only listen, and we'll hear the sobs, the laughter, the whispers of the past reaching out. And when you gently close your eyes, imagine yourself walking on an ancient stone path where the footsteps of countless souls once fell. They loved, they hoped, they feared, they dreamed, just like you, just like me. They didn't know they were living in what we'd one day call the Middle Ages. They were simply living with all their hearts. So before sleep embraces you, hold on to a little of the warmth from that tiny lamp, so that when you wake, you'll remember each of us, no matter how small, is an irreplaceable thread in the endless tapestry of human history. And as night falls, laying a soft veil over thatched rooftops and silver fields bathed in moonlight, the medieval village sinks once more into its ancient rhythm, where every footstep echoes the traditions passed down through generations. In that peaceful darkness, a farmer lays down his hoe, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. Yet his heart still beats in tune with the life he has always known. He, like so many others, lives under the long shadow of the castle, where a proud lord grants both protection and demand. It is a world where loyalty is measured in sweat and peace often comes at the cost of harsh harvest seasons. The farmer doesn't need to understand the treaties between kings and nobles. He only knows that he must sow, reap, pay taxes, and begin again. Life is a wheel, turning without end, without escape. Inside the small cottage, the flickering firelight dances across the face of a sleeping child. Beside the hearth, a mother quietly mends her husband's worn coat, eyes red from exhaustion, yet shining with a gentle, patient strength. Outside, the livestock are gathered in the barn, and the creaking of the water wheel sounds like the whisper of history, not loud, but steady and enduring. Farther away, in silent monasteries, monks continue their sacred task of copying scripture, each letter a prayer offered up to time. They are the keepers of knowledge amid the darkness, quiet lights illuminating the path for generations yet to come. And somewhere in the growing towns, merchants begin to trade goods for silver, opening the way to a new order, where money and literacy begin to replace swords and blood. But in this moment, this peaceful moment of the night, all of it belongs to a great painting in motion. The farmer, the lord, the monk, the mother, the child, they are not just characters in history books, but flesh and blood, living and breathing within a deep current of time they do not even realize they are part of. And dear listener, have you ever felt your heart grow still as you imagine such a scene? Have you ever shivered at the thought that in those simple, repeated cycles, humanity preserved its faith, its love, its very identity? They did not live to be remembered in history. They lived simply to live, and perhaps that is the most noble thing of all. So now, as night gently wraps the world in its arms, as the wind sighs through the trees and the warmth of the last lamp still lingers, let your heart drift with the flow of time. Let history no longer be dry words on a page, but breath and skin and sorrow and hope, something you can feel within your own quiet breaths tonight. And if this story brought stillness to your heart, if the voice you heard made you love your present life just a little more, leave a trace of love. Share this video with someone who needs a peaceful sleep. And remember, so many more stories are waiting to be told beneath this late night lamp. And while the night still lingers over the quiet thatched rooftops, as the fire in the hearth slowly fades, dreams continue in silence. The farmer has drifted into deep sleep, yet the world does not stand still. In villages scattered between valleys and hills, the crops are still sown, the festivals still celebrated, and children still grow up within the repeating rhythm of a life so ancient it seems unchanging. Yet, somewhere within that society, something has begun to stir. Like a quiet breeze slipping through the cracks in a wooden door, something is coming, slowly, but inevitably. In the crowded towns, a new class has begun to emerge. Merchants, craftsmen, those who live not from the soil but from trade, skill, and ingenuity. They carry no swords, ride no war horses, but they wield contracts and calculations. They exchange gold instead of oaths. And they quietly, persistently began to change what once seemed eternal. They opened markets, built homes, formed guilds. They did not need noble titles to gain influence, for coin and intellect had become the new power. In the growing cities, the clang of hammers, the snip of shears, and the morning cries of street vendors rose like the fresh heartbeat of an approaching age. At the same time, within the thick stone walls of monasteries, Another quiet wave was also beginning to swell. The monks, who once only copied the scriptures, now studied Aristotle, Plato, and ancient texts forgotten for centuries. Debates about the soul, about free will, about the relationship between humanity and God, all were beginning to shake the foundations of doctrines once thought unchangeable. And slowly, under the gentle glow of candlelight, a new age, the Renaissance, was beginning to awaken as silently as dewdrops sinking into the earth. The farmer still sleeps, his hands still calloused, his dreams still simple. He does not know the names of philosophers, nor does he care about the rise of the merchant class. But he and we are all standing within the great current of history, where each small ripple will one day become a vast sea. And, in this moment, in the middle of the night, we can hear the sound of that change most clearly, soft as a breath, deep as humanity's memory, a low, steady heartbeat echoing from the past. So if you're lying quietly now, your eyes closed beneath the gentle glow of a lamp, let this voice carry you back to those ancient nights, where every person, whether king or peasant, was writing their part in a shared story. And tomorrow, when you awaken, know that you are not merely a listener, but a living part of the great symphony that stretches from the small hearth fires of the medieval world to the very dream you now carry in your heart. As the morning light slowly filters through the thin veil of mist, the medieval world begins to drift into memory. It may seem as though everything has faded. The armored warriors, the stone churches, the hymns echoing through the valleys. But in truth, it all still lingers here, in our minds, like a trail of smoke that hasn't yet disappeared. In the stillness of the night, we glimpse a great figure slowly fading through the mist of remembrance. Charlemagne, a name that evokes an entire age, not merely because he was the first emperor of the West after the fall of Rome, but because he embodied a longing for order, for a realm where faith, knowledge, and power walked hand in hand. On a cold Christmas morning in the year 800, while Europe still slumbered, the Pope approached and placed a crown upon his head inside the great basilica. And from that moment, a new empire was born, not only by sword and shield, but through the sacred weight of symbolism. But Charlemagne was also human. He fought, he ruled, and he too made mistakes. His empire eventually dissolved like all dreams of humankind. Yet the light he kindled still smolders quietly to this day. You see, history is never just dusty pages. It lives in the heartbeat of ordinary people. The farmers who still tilled the hillsides, unaware that their lives were slowly being reshaped by invisible currents, reforms, waves of learning, the triumph of printing, and the spreading of knowledge like wildfire across open fields. When you walk across the cold gray stones of an old monastery, or pause to hear the bells tolling from an ancient church, you are stepping into a shared memory, and in that memory, we still hear Charlemagne's footsteps echo through the grand hall, whispered prayers from worn pews, and the longing for a world where reason and faith build together. The history of the Middle Ages did not end with a bang, but with a sigh as the dawn of the Renaissance crept across the horizon. And like a storyteller bidding farewell by the firelight, that age gently reminds us, remember what we've passed through. Remember the seeds of hope sown in the darkness, because, like all those centuries before, we, the living, will also become a layer of memory in the minds of those who come after. They will look back at us as we once looked at Charlemagne, with wonder, admiration, and perhaps a touch of doubt. But maybe the most important thing is this: we lived, we loved, we failed, we tried again, and we left something behind for the world. So now, as your breath slows and your eyes close in the quiet of night, let Charlemagne and the shadows of the past lull you into sleep, not as distant legends, but as quiet souls who once stood at the crossroads of time, where darkness and light met. And perhaps when you awaken tomorrow, a glimmer of that light will still be there within you. As night falls over the silent towers and the church bells fade into the wind, the storyteller gently guides you away from the glow of the medieval world. But before we part from that era, let us linger for a moment, like a traveler pausing at the end of a long journey, turning back for one last look at the strange land just passed. Through the thin dust of memory, small villages appear, where children once played beneath the rare sunlight, where wives stood on doorsteps awaiting husbands returning from war, and where elderly monks quietly copied ancient texts by candlelight. These quiet, ordinary moments were the true soul of the age, not the crowns, not the swords, but the silent pulse of human life. Can you hear it? The murmur of market day, the hoofbeats of a horse about to leave the gates, the lullaby of a mother singing her child to sleep. These sounds are still here, somewhere in humanity's memory, echoing like an old song that refuses to fade away. Even as castles crumble to rubble and cathedrals crack beneath the hand of time, the human spirit stands firm. The thirst for learning, the compassion for others, and the dreams of a fairer world, all of it took root in that seemingly harsh land. That's what makes the Middle Ages so magical. Not the glitter of kings, but the quiet resilience of small souls. You and I, we don't need to be emperors to leave a mark on history. All it takes is a heart still capable of feeling, a pair of eyes willing to look back, and a promise to live fully in the present. And that is enough to make us part of the long chain of those who once dreamed, once hoped. Now, as the light dims and the story nears its end, let your spirit rest in this moment. Let your imagination drift over the lush green hills of old Europe, where a humble farmer quietly sows his seeds, not knowing that he, too, is sowing the future. History does not end. It merely steps aside, making room for new dreams. And you, lying here now, listening to these whispers in the dark, you are also writing a chapter with the beating of your heart, with the quiet awakening in tonight's sleep. If you felt peace in this story, if your heart softened or shivered at a single image, then please hold on to that feeling. Share this video with someone else who may be seeking a place of rest for their soul. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, soft-spoken tales that lull you into dreams, please follow this channel. For history still holds countless secrets, and this small storyteller, will always be waiting for you by the night lamp. May you have a gentle, restful, and dream-filled sleep. Under the soft glow of the night lamp, we sit together once more, surrounded by the stillness of the night and the gentle breath of time. In this quiet moment, we continue our journey along the winding paths of history, not through triumphs or crowns, but through the fragile hopes that carried humanity through the darkness. As the medieval world gradually fades, one might believe that all its glory has vanished into shadow. But no, from those ashes, a new flame was kindled, a flame of learning, of searching for meaning, of longing to touch something greater than oneself. Imagine yourself walking through a small morning market where the first printed books are laid out, still fragrant with the scent of fresh paper, carrying not only the words of saints but also the thoughts of once forgotten, ordinary souls. Printing was not merely an invention. It was a bridge stretched across the chasm of time, connecting distant villagers to the ideas shaking the foundations of great centers of knowledge. Elsewhere, in quiet classrooms, students sit bowed under candlelight, poring over ancient Greek and Roman texts. The knowledge of antiquity, once thought lost to the dust of war and superstition, had returned, not as lifeless relics, but as living seeds, ready to sprout in soil watered by blood, tears, and dreams. And within every heart, from nobleman to blacksmith, a strange new feeling began to stir, that maybe, just maybe, life could be more than submission and survival. That we were not born merely to serve, but to understand, to explore, to love, and to live a life with a voice of our own. Can you feel it? That faint shiver from the written word, not from fear, but from awakening. In the great turning wheel of history, there is always a moment when the light begins to bend. And in that moment, people stop looking only to kings and begin to turn inward. I invite you, not just to hear a story, but to feel a turning point where memory is not merely preserved, but reborn, where you are not just a listener, but a thread in the great tapestry of human awakening. If your heart stirred at a detail, an image, or just the rhythm of a distant memory, then hold on to it. That is the invisible thread connecting you to the souls who once lived, dreamed, longed, and hoped just like you. And if you are still awake, still listening, still feeling, then I welcome you to continue with me into the next chapter, where ships begin to cross oceans and the world stretches far beyond its old stone walls. But if your eyes are already closing, then let gentle sleep carry you, bearing the image of an era in transformation. And in your dreams, let history whisper that you are never an outsider. You are a living witness to the turning paths this world has taken. And that is why you are still here, listening, even now. Under the dim twilight of the medieval evening, it was not the clatter of knights' hooves or the sermons of monks that echoed, but the clinking of coins on wooden counters, the murmured haggling of men and women in linen cloaks, a new class emerging quietly, like a breeze of change. They were not born into nobility, nor did they hold authority from the church, yet their presence slowly shook the seemingly unbreakable foundations. These townsfolk, the burghers and merchants, once deemed lowly, reclaimed their place in a society divided by bloodlines and rank, armed only with intellect, persistence, and commerce. If once power belonged solely to the sword and scripture, now wealth no longer flowed from taxes or war, but from the endless veins of trade, where spices from the East, silk from India, and gold and silver from Africa poured into bustling cities like Bruges, Florence, and Lübeck. These merchants, patient by day on muddy roads, calculating by candlelight at night, lit a new flame for Europe. Not a fire that blazed like war, but one that glowed steadily like a hearth in a winter cottage, warming hearts with a vision of a different kind of life. Dear listener, imagine yourself standing in a lively 14th century marketplace, surrounded by stalls filled with textiles, spices, and shimmering glassware. The scent of nutmeg hangs in the crisp air, and the calls of vendors rise more joyfully than hymns in the church. This isn't merely commerce, it's a quiet revolution. The emotion here isn't as fierce as on a battlefield, but it still sends a shiver, a mix of anticipation and quiet awe. Because we sense that something profound is unfolding, not in castles, not atop bell towers, but on cobblestone paths beneath bare feet, where the seemingly nameless are shaping the future. Some kings never set foot in cities, some monks disdained profit. But the townsfolk, they were different. They bought the lands of declining nobles, sponsored guilds of artisans, and sent their children to newly rising universities. They had no family crests, but carried a new bloodline, one of renewal, of learning, and of hope. And so, beneath the surface of the old society, new cells began to stir. They didn't need swords, only calculations. No dogma, just ink and parchment. No throne, just a seat on the city council. It was they, the burghers, who became the bridge that carried Europe from feudal darkness to the light of the Renaissance. So tonight, as darkness falls, listen closely to the footsteps of the past. Not the clash of weapons, but the slow, steady march of those without titles, who quietly changed the world. Let their image lull you to sleep, so you may dream of a time when history was no longer made only by kings and lords, but by anyone bold enough to dream, to act, and to believe. As the candle of the medieval world flickered in the winds of change, another flame began to quietly glow, not from atop a cathedral, but from the cold stone walls of monasteries and the hidden lecture halls behind growing cities. It was the light of doubt, gentle, yet persistent, silent, yet deeply powerful. For centuries, the church had been the center of all things, of faith, of law, of the soul, and of power. The towering walls of cathedrals reached toward the heavens, as if to speak to God on humanity's behalf. But beneath those grand domes, in the dim shadows of wealth and authority, there sometimes echoed whispers of deceit, greed, and oppression. Not everyone accepted it. In distant monasteries, where monks kept vigil through the night by oil lamps, they did more than copy scriptures. They recorded questions, thoughts about justice, about the soul, and about the very hands that claimed to lead the way to salvation. Could a man in golden robes truly be closer to God than one in rags, kneeling outside? In the young universities of Paris, Bologna, Oxford, where new minds were rising, scholars began to turn the pages of Scripture with the gaze of reason. They loved God, yes, but they loved truth even more. Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, names that now mark milestones of knowledge, were once conflicted souls, loyal to the church, yet unafraid to question blind faith. In their debates, no one shouted, no one condemned. Only quiet questions were asked, yet they were enough to shake the very foundation of ecclesiastical power. How could a holy faith thrive in gilded palaces while its followers starved in the harshness of winter? And that feeling began to spread, not like a storm, but like rain sinking deep into the soil. A gentle compassion for those punished for daring to ask, why? A silent ache at the sight of those burned alive for not praying the prescribed way. A chill of sorrow upon learning that young monks had died in prison, simply for translating sacred texts into the language of common folk. History is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is whispered through hidden pages tucked inside a friar's robe, through smudged ink on old parchment, through the steady gaze of a student standing firm before religious authority. No, this is not a tale against faith. This is a story of true love for faith, a love strong enough not to accept its corruption, deep enough to distinguish between God and those who speak in his name. And, it was from such doubts, such small drops of questioning, that a new river began to flow. A river of freedom, of reason, of light. As you drift into sleep tonight, while the world grows quiet, imagine the turning of a monk's page in the dark. That soft rustle is not mere study. It is an awakening, a whisper sent forward in time. They had no weapons, they had no throne, but they had thought, and sometimes a single question, asked at just the right moment, can make an entire era stop and listen. There was a time when the moon cast its silver glow upon cold stone monasteries that people began to wonder, was it truly the hand of God hidden behind the golden ring worn on the finger of popes? Or, behind that sacred robe, was there simply the heart of a mortal, just as full of ambition as any other? The church, long a beacon of faith, guiding lost souls and soothing fears of the afterlife with prayer, had, over time, seen its light dimmed by shadows. The wooden pews that once held bowed heads in confession became places where whispered doubts were exchanged. Why does the church live in splendor, while we suffer in the snow-covered fields? Within the gray stone walls of monasteries, as candlelight flickered beside sacred texts, some monks stayed awake through the night, not just to pray, but to write. They wrote not in praise, but in questions, not in doctrine, but in unease. Perhaps they had once believed without question. But then, when a scholar saw starving children outside a monastery adorned in gold, or when a student uncovered a passage of scripture deliberately hidden from the public, a small crack in faith began to spread like melting ice in the quiet of spring. They did not rebel. They did not blaspheme. They simply whispered questions. Beside candles flickering like trembling souls, does true power come from God or from gold and politics? And the people began to listen, not with their ears, but with their hearts. The heart of a mother who had lost her child in a war waged in the name of the cross. The heart of a laborer punished for translating scripture into his native tongue. And the hearts of children growing up in fear, warned that without obeying the church, they would never see heaven. So gentle, and yet so painful. We cannot deny the beauty the church brought forth, the sacred music, the magnificent art. But neither can we turn away from what was buried, the trials for heresy, the prison cells where young monks perished in silence, simply for a different line in a book they had written. And it was within this conflict, between light and shadow, between faith and doubt, that an awakening took shape, not through bloodshed, not through revolt, but through a generation brave enough to think, brave enough to look deep into their faith and ask, do I believe in God or in the fear crafted by men? The storyteller takes no sides. They only shine a light, gently, like moonlight at night, like the distant echo of a bell from a church now closed. And if you listen quietly in the stillness of your room, you may hear it, the rustle of ancient pages, the sigh of a priest who knows he can no longer remain silent, and the whisper of your own conscience, asking the same brave questions the scholars of old once dared to speak. Let this story lull you to sleep, not to forget, but to remember that sometimes truth does not knock like thunder, but arrives as a gentle whisper in the night. As night slowly descended upon the once majestic castles perched atop the hills, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves, whispering of a changing era. The cold stone walls of the feudal system, once as immovable as fate itself, began to tremble beneath the rising tides swelling within the heart of Europe. And in the midst of that long, dark night, another figure quietly emerged. Not a bishop, not a lord, but the king. No longer bound by the chains of quarrelsome lords or trembling before the mighty pope, the new king of this age rose among his people as a growing symbol of the nation, of a new order, of a dream for unity. The first nation-states began to take shape, not just loose collections of fiefdoms, but communities bound by a common language, a shared flag, and a collective yearning. As France rose from the ashes of the 100 Years' War, as England began to form centralized institutions of power, as Spain united through royal marriage and Catholic faith, a new breath of air slipped quietly into the ancient corners of Europe. The knights, abbots, and clerics who once held the soul of the old world were now slowly being replaced by royal advisors, lawyers, and tax collectors, those who served the state rather than the church. The people, once accustomed to gazing up at church towers in search of faith, now began looking toward their capital cities in search of justice. The king gradually became the emblem of loyalty and a new kind of hope, while the church, once the sole refuge of the soul, began to face a new question. Who truly was chosen by God? Who deserved to rule both the body and the soul? In the lit rooms of the first universities, scholars bravely began to question the authority of the Pope, the sanctity of Scripture, and even the very foundation of feudal law. With strokes of black ink on parchment, they dared to write what was once considered blasphemy. That royal power might come from the people, that a nation could be built on reason rather than myth. From the growing cities emerged a new class, the burghers, the printers, the literate, who began to dream of a world less dependent on old nobles and divine right. And the king, once the center of ceremony and symbolic power, now became a true sovereign, one who could levy taxes, command armies, and draft laws. The fading of feudalism did not come through a bloody war, but through 1,000 tiny fractures in hearts, in minds, in hushed conversations at the dinner table. People no longer saw themselves as vassals of a particular lord, but began to call their homeland by its national name. Je suis français. I am English, asterisk. Simple phrases that carried enough strength to tilt the course of history. Even now, in the quiet slumber of the listener, the spirit of that age breathes into each breath we take. Because the stories of rising nations are not just chapters of history, they are mirrors reflecting our own present. We are still living in the echoes of those choices, believing in reason, yearning for a more just order, and always questioning the powers that once seemed untouchable. Let the dream of the Middle Ages lull you, and all of us, into a peaceful night, where we may return silently beneath the distant toll of church bells, and remember that no matter how many centuries pass, the human heart still turns toward the light of justice and hope. And as the old bells that once echoed from cathedral towers begin to fade into memory, a new rhythm rises from the heart of the city streets. It is the sound of wooden clogs on cobbled roads, the murmurs of books and debate in newly founded universities, where scholars no longer bowed before authority, but dared to ask questions. The storyteller pauses, then continues in a voice as soft as a breeze by your ear. Something is changing, not as sudden as thunder, but smoldering like a fire burning deep within a stone hearth in winter. Kings are no longer just symbols of inheritance. They are becoming symbols of a people, of a land, of a collective voice. They write laws not just for lords, but for their subjects too. And the dream of a nation, an idea that had never truly existed before, slowly begins to take shape. Meanwhile, the merchant class swells within the bustling towns. They form guilds, establish charters, pay taxes, and gradually, they demand a voice. Beneath their humble cloaks lie quick minds and a determination no less fierce than the warriors on the battlefield. They carry no swords, but they are changing the world with coin and signature. Can you hear it? In the stillness of night, if you listen deeply enough, you might catch the scratch of a quill in a distant monastery, where a young monk dares to write a radical thought. The power of God and the power of the Pope, are they truly one and the same? A simple question, and yet enough to shake the very foundations of an entire order. In that atmosphere, the church, once the grandest shelter, begins to realize it is no longer the only one. Beneath stone vaults, prayers still echo, but outside the walls, the murmurs of the people are spreading. They ask, who truly speaks for God? Who has the right to forgive? And why can the rich buy indulgences while the poor go without? Time passes, like water dripping slowly into a cup already full. And someday, that cup will overflow. But tonight, in this story, we remain in the quiet moment before the wave. The moment when reflection first begins to seep into hearts, from young monks to kings themselves, pondering the true nature of power. There is something deeply human in this shift. A vague fear, a longing to be understood, and a simple wish to live more justly. And perhaps that is why we listen to old stories, to understand that the past is not dead. It only sleeps in our minds, waiting for a voice to awaken it. And, right now, in the steady rhythm of night, you are the one carrying that flow forward. By listening, by feeling, by allowing your heart to walk alongside those ancient footsteps echoing down the corridors of history. And then, in the stillest moment of the century, as the shadow of cathedrals still stretched long across the cobbled streets, another figure quietly emerged, the knight. Not merely a sword-bearing servant of lords, but a symbol of an ideal slowly fading away. There is something beautiful and profoundly lonely in the stance of the knight at the end of the medieval era. He is the living memory of a world slipping into twilight, a world of unwavering loyalty, of honor, of oaths sworn beneath stone walls and torn banners fluttering in the wind. But as merchants grew wealthy, and kings needed silver more than blood, the knight's sword slowly lost its place on the board of power. They became whispers in the night, just like this voice now whispering into your ear. Men who lived by ideals, but found themselves adrift in a new age, where money, knowledge, and the collective strength of the nation were beginning to replace the personal virtue of loyalty. Some of them became legends. William Marshall, for instance, called the greatest knight, not because he never lost, but because he never betrayed. He fought not just for kings, but for an old, fading notion blowing away in the wind: honor. But can honor survive in a world shedding its skin? When printing presses spread ideas faster than swords ever could, when universities became the new fortresses of intellect, and when the middle class began to teach their children to dream of becoming scholars or merchants, not knights. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine an early morning in a cold stone castle as the last knight dismounts his horse, removes his armor, and realizes there is no one left who needs him. The church bells still ring, but no longer call men to crusade. They call for debates about taxes, trade laws, and national borders. It was a death without an elegy. No trumpets, no anthems, only history passing quietly by, and a dream shattered beneath the hooves of its own creation. The age of knights has not vanished. It sleeps in the memory of us all. Every time you hear words like loyalty, duty, honor, a piece of them awakens once more. Softly, like a shadow by the moss-covered walls, or like this story now whispering to you in the silence of the night. Can you hear it? The echo of a bell ringing across the misty valley. But this time, it is not the call to arms, nor the summons to church. It is the echo of transformation, a moment when the monastery was no longer the absolute center of knowledge. In the gentle darkness beneath ancient vaulted ceilings, once hallowed spaces of contemplation and prayer, a new sound arises: the soft scratching of quills on parchment, whispered debates between scholars, and the hurried footsteps of ideas searching for the light. The monks still prayed, still copied sacred texts, but somewhere in those cold stone corridors, brave souls had begun to ask questions. They did not betray faith, but they started to notice the cracks in the once inviolable walls of the church. Holiness, power, and truth. Could these truly coexist in perfect harmony? There were young students, their eyes alight beneath flickering candlelight, reading Aristotle, Ptolemy, daring to dream of a world explained not only by faith, but by reason. In newly founded universities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, thought was no longer locked inside monasteries. It was set free, like doors thrown open to let wind stir a space once stifled by taboos. And so, in the quiet of cathedral towers at night, small lines began to appear in the margins of holy texts. Should human power be bound by religion? A question that didn't thunder, but dripped slowly, quietly into the minds of generations. From that point, thinkers like Thomas Aquinas sought to reconcile faith with reason. They did not aim to destroy belief. They wanted it to stand on firmer ground. But not everyone understood. For some, asking questions was an insult. For others, it was the soul's greatest act of courage. And so, the world began to pull away from the church's monopoly over morality and knowledge. Not because people lost faith in God, but because they began to believe that God had given them reason to use. Can you imagine it? A night in a silent monastery, the soft sound of rain tapping on the stone windows. An old monk sits deep in thought, his trembling hand placing a worn book aside, his eyes gazing into the distance. Perhaps it is time we also listen to voices beyond these walls. And from that deep night, history began to change. Close your eyes and imagine a silent field after the rain. where tattered flags still flutter in the gentle breeze, where hoofprints are pressed deep into mud and blood, but also where courage never dies. In the memory of the Middle Ages, few images are as haunting and beautiful as that of a knight, clad in heavy iron armor, riding through the sound of horns, not only for victory, but for honor, for a vow once spoken, for loyalty to something greater than himself. He was not perfect. Sometimes he faltered, sometimes he felt a pride. But when you look into the knight's eyes, you see a reflection of the eternal struggle between ideals and reality. A man, but also a symbol. Storytellers of old passed down tales of knights who never yielded to darkness. They knew they might die on the battlefield, and still chose that death, believing that the beauty of life was not in how long it lasted, but in how one stood and fought, even with a single breath left. They were defenders of the weak, those who bowed before women and children, those who etched their names into history not with ink, but with sacrifice. Can you picture it? Late at night, in an abandoned castle, the moonlight streaming through a broken window, falling upon a rusted sword. No one remembers the name of its owner, but in the earth, where the souls of knights rest, eternity is not carved in stone, but in the memory of generations who recall a courage that could not be defeated. And, that ideal still lives on. No armor needed, no warhorse, just a heart that refuses to fall in the face of what is right, even when the whole world turns away. In the silent darkness of history, it was people like this who lit the flame humanity has carried from century to century. So, if you ever feel lost, if you ever feel tired, remember the shadow of the knight of old. Not to become someone great, but to never forget that you always have the power to choose dignity, bravery, and kindness. Let the echo of ancient hoofbeats whisper through your soul tonight, a soft reminder that some values will never be forgotten. And then, in the quiet turns of time, as the light of the old age began to fade behind the stone arches of monasteries and the painted towers of noble halls, another image slowly emerged. It was the night. No longer did the thunder of hooves echo across battlefields, nor did steel flash beneath the sweat-drenched summer sun. Yet that figure endured, not as a warrior, but as a symbol. The knight, clad in armor and bound by an oath of honor, had passed through wars, praises, and mournful farewells, only to become a quiet emblem in the hearts of generations to come. Amidst the whirlwind of change, where nations were beginning to take shape, where merchants stepped between the powers of kings and clergy, where printed books crept into humble homes, the image of the knight was no longer a living figure, but a shared dream of an entire culture, a dream of loyalty, of honor, and of noble sacrifice. They say there was once a knight who refused to draw his sword in the face of insults, because he understood that true honor was not measured in spilled blood, but in restraint. Another, bound by a sacred vow, walked hundreds of miles through the night to save a peasant from wrongful punishment, not by royal command, but by the quiet voice of justice. Such stories, passed down from one generation to the next, became little flames in the hearts of listeners, warming them whenever the darkness of meaninglessness crept in. Many once believed that when armor was laid aside, when castles became no more than tourist destinations, the spirit of knighthood had died. But no, it merely changed its cloak. Within every human heart, there remains some dream, some longing to become someone brave enough to defend what is right, gentle enough to feel the pain of others, and steadfast enough to keep a promise, even if only to oneself. Perhaps that is why, even today, in an age of machines and hurried lives, our hearts still grow quiet when we hear tales of unwavering loyalty. Perhaps it is because we, no matter how many centuries have passed, still need a symbol to remind us of the simple, eternal values we must not forget. And so, beside the soft glow of a midnight lamp, within the dreaming silence of a long night, the night still lives, not with sword or steed, but in every heart that still beats for justice, in every eye that fills with tears at the sight of injustice, and in every spirit that refuses to kneel before the temptation of power. Because sometimes, in a world constantly changing, it is the old things, the distant symbols, that become the quiet refuge for the soul. And when the echo of the night's final footsteps fades into the mist of memory, another figure emerges, quieter, but no less powerful, the scribe, seated beneath the flickering glow of candlelight, surrounded by parchment and silence. He holds not a sword, but a quill. He defends no fortress, but safeguards knowledge. In an age where understanding was a rare privilege, every word he penned was like a seed sown to resist the darkness of ignorance. In remote monasteries, amid the scent of fresh ink and whispered prayers, these quiet souls copied ancient texts with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. They weren't just transcribing words. They were preserving wisdom, faith, and dreams. All the things that survive time not through might, but through gentle perseverance. That monk, bent over a manuscript, may never have wielded a blade in battle. And yet, he may have saved more kingdoms than any king. For when he recorded the thoughts of philosophers, the teachings of old, the poems of star-crossed lovers, and the maps of the heavens, he ensured the fire of knowledge would not go out. It's a strange comfort to imagine that while the world outside raged with war and chaos, someone, ink-stained and steadfast, was quietly preserving memory for the future. Perhaps that's why, today, when we turn the page of an old book, or read a sentence that transcends time, we feel a subtle shiver, as if an invisible hand had touched our shoulder and whispered, "You are not alone. Someone once dreamed, just like you." There is a beauty in that, and a quiet solace, because not all heroes wear armor. Some wear the plain robes of a monk. Some choose to write rather than shout. And some, like the scribe, devote their lives to preserving what the eyes cannot see, the soul of a civilization. And so, within the vast tapestry of time, woven among threads of courage and faith, are also threads of written words, delicate, yet enduring, silent, yet eternal. So tonight, as you rest your head on the pillow, let the imagined sound of a quill gliding across parchment lull you to sleep. Picture the gentle turning of pages, in rhythm with the steady breath of someone long ago, someone who believed that writing, too, could be an act of love. Because it is through such seemingly invisible gestures that the human spirit is preserved. And because of that, we still dare to dream. And now, as the candle flickers quietly at the end of time's long corridor, another figure appears, tall, silent, yet never truly gone. It is Charlemagne, no longer seated upon a throne, no warhorse galloping across the European plains. And yet, his name still echoes. Charlemagne could not hold together the vast empire he had struggled to build. After his death, the dream of a unified Europe beneath his crown began to fracture. His sons, his heirs, each drifted toward different horizons, like shards of a crown that once gleamed in the darkness. But sometimes, true influence lies not in what we preserve, but in what we plant. And Charlemagne, the emperor of that winter in the year 800, sowed immense seeds into the soil of history. It was he who laid the foundation for the idea of a Christian Europe, not merely as territory, but as identity. It was he who revived learning during the Dark Ages, founding monastic schools where peasant children learned to read, to write, and to dream. It was he who expanded the vision of a king, not just as a warrior, but as a protector of culture, education, and faith. In this drifting journey through memory, can you hear it? The footsteps of those who came after Otto I of Germany, Charles V of France, all walked within the long shadow of Charlemagne. They did not only inherit a throne, but a longing and a responsibility to history. And on some nights, when the world feels too loud, imagine this: someone whispering to you from long ago, "I failed to hold the empire, but my seeds still grew in the soil." Do not fear when dreams collapse, as long as they leave behind light for those who follow. And so, we still feel his presence in the limestone buildings of Aachen, in schools that bear his name, in charters that still echo with the phrase, "Holy Roman Empire," like a soft bell ringing through ancient winds. Yes, Charlemagne may not have preserved his empire, but he preserved something greater: its soul. A soul that lives on through the centuries, in words, in ideas, in the belief that one person can do more than rule. They can shift the course of history. And when you close your eyes tonight, as moonlight slips through the curtain and time casts long shadows across old walls, remember, some legacies are not held in crowns, but in every breath of a civilization. Under the dim glow of the night lamp, when every sound seems to slow down and time flows quietly like an underground stream, the stories of the Middle Ages are not merely distant memories. They are mirrors reflecting the human soul through the centuries. And from that stream of tales, we come to realize something simple yet profound. History is not just the past. It is a living lesson for the present, and a gentle whisper to the future. In that flow, the image of humble peasants, living in hardship yet never losing their kindness, makes us reflect on our own lives today. They had nothing but their hands and their faith, yet they continued to sow, to nurture the flame of life, even when war and disease knocked on every village door. They teach us this: no matter how harsh life becomes, kindness and perseverance are torches that light the way through the darkness. Then come the nights, not only fighting with swords, but with loyalty, honor, and faith. In a chaotic world where no one could be certain if peace would survive the next dawn, they chose to live for ideals, even knowing those ideals might leave them lonely. Their stories are not to glorify violence, but to remind us courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep going even when the heart still trembles. We also meet the thinkers, the quiet monks at their writing desks, lighting the flame of knowledge in the long darkness of their age. Because of them, the seeds of freedom, of reason, of questioning were planted. It is from them that we understand. Truth always needs someone brave enough to ask. And if we are courageous enough to listen to the small voice within, However faint, we too are continuing the flame they once preserved. From the rising tide of townsfolk to the collapse of feudalism and the awakening of nation-states, all of it forms a symphony of movement and hope. These were not just political shifts, they are proof of an eternal truth. No power is forever, only the yearning for a better life truly endures. And that message, dear friend, still holds true in our world today, where we, too, are searching for meaning, justice, and something to believe in during uncertain times. History reminds us, live with the courage of knights, the compassion of peasants, and the thirst for freedom of ancient thinkers. Each of us can be part of that flowing current if we cherish values, learn from the past, and walk forward with a heart that does not fall asleep. And if these stories have touched your heart, stay with this channel so that each night we may once again be lulled to sleep by the whispers of history. Share this video with someone you care about, because who knows, perhaps a peaceful sleep tonight will begin with a gentle story like this one. Wishing you beautiful things and the deepest of dreams.